is or would Jesus have been a liberal? It's a complicated issue. It's a challenging question, and it's got an interesting theological implication to it that I'll talk about in a minute. But I think before we get there, kind of setting the precedent, if we're talking about a classical liberal, there's three primary connotations to that. The first is open to new ideas. Second is rejecting traditional ideas or concepts, and the third is rejecting traditionalism as like an idea that we uphold traditional ideas for the sake of the traditions themselves. And then there's a fourth that's basically like that kind of priming a new process of learning or a holistic process of learning, but we'll get there in a minute. So let's talk about those three primary aspects in turn. First, open to new ideas. Maybe when Jesus comes on the scene, following in the footsteps of John the Baptist, who prepared the way for him, he immediately starts teaching. Matthew chapter 5, you have the Sermon on the Mount. You have him talking about how like the meek will inherit the earth, that blessed are the poor. That, I mean, those are radically different sentiments than what we kind of hold to in the mainstream society. That our society is built off of, and every society in all of human history has been built off the idea that the rich rule over the poor, the strong rule over the weak, and every aspect of existence have been this way. The weak and the infirm and the elderly and the extremely young and the inexperienced just languish in society due to their reduction in traits, essentially. And you see this in the savannah where the lions and tigers, they tend to prefer the weak, the old, the infirm, the youthful, because they're easier to catch. And that, I mean, this is the basic principle of evolution, right? Survival of the fittest, and that the dominant, the strongest traits tend to win out over time. And yet Jesus comes on the scene and says, no, it's the weak that I've given my favor to. It is the poor that I will show my greatest care and favor towards. And it is the meek that I have given the earth as an inheritance to. So, new ideas. And that's kind of like, as far as Christianity, the primary thing that it has impacted the world with is this sentiment of the weak, the young, the infirm, the elderly, and the poor are to be protected and insulated and helped and assisted in ways that prior societies simply did not do. If you were weak, you would be left behind. You would be abandoned to the elements. If you were too old, you would be abandoned. If you were too young, you would be ignored. If you were female, or if you were like that, they were pushed to the margins of society and treated as second-class citizens. Christianity, however, allows, like Onesimus, who was a slave, a runaway slave, making him not just a property individual, but a criminal, was a elder and a leader in the Christian church, tasked with the responsibility of carrying one of the letters that we have now actually canonized in Scripture on behalf of Paul. You have Timothy and Titus, both, who are exhorted despite their youth as leaders in the church. You have Peter, who is pretty much an idiot. Like, no one disagrees with that, and yet he is the chief leader, one that is the most important, even in, like, some of the more radical Catholics might even say is more important than Jesus, practically, in the way that he's shaped the church. Like, that it's the poor that have taken a leadership role in society, in Christian terms. That's one of the primary marks of Westernism, and that's introduced by Christ. He brought a new idea on the scene. We've run with it, and it is one of the most important shaping concepts in Western and especially American Protestant society. So maybe he was. As far as rejecting traditions, no. Because when you have this weird traditions and traditionalism are so close together, we have to separate them. And Jesus, despite these things being so similar and interwoven in a lot of ways, Jesus had a very nuanced approach to both. And that if you were a traditionalist, the way the Pharisees and Sadducees had been in his society, he gave them nothing but the business over and over and over again. They confronted him on it over and over and over again, of hand washing and the Sabbath, and just like that. Jesus is like, no, wait a minute. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You've had it backwards. Your traditionalism that seeks to just preserve things for the sake of preserving them is broken, and it's backwards and inverted, and you need to reset this thing. It's not about the temple, it's about the God of the temple. And he confronts them as well of the religious people would quibble over how oaths were. Is it enough to just swear on behalf of the temple, or do I say the gold of the temple? And that they would try to weasel their way out of their obligation. And think, well, I swore on the temple, but not on the gold of the temple, so it's not binding. Like, Jesus, like, no, not only don't do that, that's ridiculous, but don't even take oaths. Just let your yes be yes and a no be no, and just let your words stand on their own merit. But as far as traditions, when confronted on the subject of divorce, according to the Pharisees, like, that they could just write off a woman for any reason. But Jesus says, no, wait a minute. Moses permitted you to have divorce on account of your hardness of heart. But that is not the way that it was intended to be. But in fact, let every man leave his father and mother and be cleaved to his wife, and together they become one flesh. And let no man separate what God has brought together. Let no one separate. He actually takes a hardline conservativist approach to marriage. It's like, listen, that's not the way it was intended to be. It's not the way it's supposed to be now, and it shouldn't be that way in the future. That actually there's a better way than that, that's even more conservative than what. And his disciples pull him aside and say, like, wait a minute, so no divorce? Are you kidding me? And they say, like, you know what, it's better to not get married at all if I can't just divorce a woman whenever I feel like it. Which, if that's not American masculine society right now, I don't know what would be. That is the most MGTOW verse in all of the Bible, quite frankly. He's taking their idea of, like, and Jesus says, you know what? If you can't handle this is too tough of a pill for you to swallow, then get over it. But the thing is, still, the rules about sex still apply. So, you know what? If you can't handle being married, you can't handle the exclusivity of marriage, then don't get married. But listen, you don't get a free pass on the pleasure of sex just because you don't want to get married. So, it's really, really interesting as far as those three. Now, as far as the idea of being open to new ideas, see, what this comes down to, this is the theological section of what I'm talking about, of that what it comes down to when you say that Jesus would have been a conservative, or that Jesus would have been a liberal, that Jesus would have been a libertarian. What you're saying is, Jesus would have been on my side. Jesus would have played for my team. When in fact, all of Scripture is pointing us that the human teams, the things that we separate ourselves into, whether it's liberal, conservative, Marxist, and fascist, or anti-fascist, or whatever, like whatever it is you separate yourself into, whatever you compartmentalize yourselves into over the basis of economics and sociology and whatever, those are not Christian ideas. Those are not Christ-centered. They are not biblical. They're not God honoring. They're not. See, at the end of all things, at the end of time, when you see Revelations 19, 20, 21, 22, what you see is every tribe, tongue, nation, the word there is actually ethnos, every ethnic group in the world, and doesn't even try to like say that they all have one language, of that actually they're all singing and worshiping God and praying together to God in their own languages without division. And you go to the very beginning where you have Genesis chapter 11, it says that they had one language, and because they only had one language, they would be able to accomplish anything they wanted, put their minds to. So, see, this idea that in the beginning, they were ethnically like universal. They were all one. They were uniform, and because of that, they could accomplish anything. But at the end, they're ethnically diverse, and yet able to accomplish the only thing that mattered. They were able to participate together in the only thing that mattered, which is the glorification of God. So not only is this idea like that there's some progress to be made as society, and that we can finally aspire towards, like, even though like that we suppose in our minds that there's some great like with an election year and all this, so that if we can just get our candidate into office, if we can just get our representatives into the Capitol, if we can just get our agenda past the ballots, if we can just get our bill through Congress, that everything will be well and that everything will be fine, and that even like, you know what, if we can just get God on our side, like if you can get God to bless what we're trying to accomplish, then everything will be fine. But actually, all of human history is God trying to get us onto his team. That all of human history is God taking a person or a nation out from the rest and be like, listen, I want you to love me. I want you to surrender to me. And if you do that, you will enjoy the peace, prosperity that you are seeking. But if you don't love me and surrender to me, then what's going to happen is you're going to experience the same problems that everyone else has. So I guess my question is, what new idea do you think you're going to come up with that is going to come across God's desk that's going to be so good that he'll be like, all right, I was on this plan, but we'll go with what you've proposed instead. As if like he's not eternal and timeless. That as if he's not both at the beginning and at the end already simultaneously. As if he isn't outside of our limited sensory and chronological boundaries. So the other thing is that as far as teaching new ideas, or kind of a holistic approach to knowledge, see, when Jesus describes himself as the way, the truth, and the life, that truth segment that's in the middle there is that if it's in contradiction to him, then it's not true, because he's truth. So something to think about. Like, this has been kind of rambly simply because, I mean, I've been thinking about this for years, going on decades now, of just what is the answer to the conundrum. Would Jesus have been a liberal, a conservative, a libertarian? Like, what would he have been? And I think the summary of it is that Jesus is not on your team. The goal of Christianity is for you to join his team.